Why is there a moving truck in my driveway? I remember thinking that before I even turned off the engine, my hands still gripping the steering wheel as the dust from the gravel road settled slowly around my car. I had only been gone for 7 days. 7 days to take care of matters that had weighed on me for months. 7 days trusting that everything I had built over 40 years would still be exactly where I left it. The Collins farm had always been that way. Steady. Predictable. Mine. But as I sat there, staring at the open gate, wide open, something I never allowed, I felt a quiet shift deep in my chest, the kind that doesn't scream danger but whispers it just loud enough that you can't ignore it. The late afternoon sun stretched across the fields, casting long shadows over the barn and the main house. From a distance, everything looked the same. The white fence. The old oak tree by the porch. The windmill turning slowly in the breeze. But then I saw the boxes. Stacked near the front steps. Not neatly, not the way I would have done it. Careless. Rushed. And then the truck. A large moving truck parked crookedly across the gravel, its back doors wide open like a mouth mid-sentence. I stepped out of the car slowly, my boots crunching against the gravel, each step feeling heavier than the last. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Daniel had a key. He had always had a key. I trusted him with that. Trusted him with everything, really. My only son. The boy I raised in this very house, who used to run through these fields barefoot, chasing chickens and laughing like the world belonged to him. I had given him that sense of belonging. I had made sure of it. As I got closer, I heard voices. Muffled at first, then clearer. Ashley's voice carried sharper than I remembered, giving instructions in a tone that didn't belong to a guest. No, those go in the truck first. Be careful with that one, it's worth more than the rest. I stopped just short of the porch steps, my eyes adjusting to the scene in front of me. 2 men I didn't recognize were carrying out one of my antique cabinets, the one my husband had built by hand over 30 years ago. I felt my breath catch, not in panic, but in something colder. Something quieter. Ashley stood near the doorway, clipboard in hand, her posture straight, her expression focused, as if she were managing a job site. Not visiting. Not helping. Managing. Daniel stood a few feet behind her, hands in his pockets, his gaze drifting anywhere but toward me. He saw me. I know he did. But he didn't move. He didn't say my name. He didn't even look surprised. That was the moment that settled it for me. Not the truck. Not the boxes. Not even the cabinet being carried away. It was the silence. The absence of recognition. The way my presence didn't seem to change anything at all. I walked the rest of the way up the path, slow and steady, my eyes taking in every detail as if I were seeing my own home for the first time. The front door was wide open. The hallway beyond it looked different. Lighter, emptier. I could already tell things were missing. Important things. Personal things. Ashley finally turned when she heard my steps on the porch. Her eyes met mine, and for a brief second, something flickered there. Not guilt. Not even surprise. Just calculation. "You're back earlier than we expected," she said, her voice calm, almost polite, as if we were discussing the weather. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence stretch, just enough to feel it settle between us. My eyes moved past her, into the house, tracing the outlines of what used to be mine. The photographs on the wall were gone. The small table by the entrance, gone. Even the rug I had picked out years ago, the one Daniel used to spill juice on as a child, was nowhere to be seen. I stepped inside without asking. The air felt different. Hollow. Like a space that had already decided I no longer belonged in it. Behind me, I heard Daniel shift his weight, as if he might finally say something. But he didn't. And that told me more than any explanation ever could. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter, the same spot I had set it down thousands of times before, and ran my fingers lightly along the surface. Clean. Too clean. As if someone had already started erasing me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand answers. Not yet. Because standing there, in the middle of a house that had somehow become unfamiliar in just 1 week, I realized something far more important than what they were taking. I realized they thought I wouldn't notice. And that was their first mistake. I did not ask any questions that afternoon because I already knew that whatever answer they gave me would not be the truth. Instead, I stood there in the kitchen, letting the silence settle around us like dust in an empty room, and for a moment I let my mind drift back to where I had been just days before. It had been a long week, the kind that stretches itself thin across your nerves without ever giving you a clear reason why. I had driven nearly 300 miles to visit an old friend from my younger years, someone I had not seen in over a decade, after hearing that her health had taken a turn. The drive itself had been quiet, the radio barely audible, my thoughts moving slowly through memories of a life that felt both distant and close at the same time. I remember thinking, as I packed my suitcase that morning, that the farm would be fine without me for a few days. Daniel had assured me of it over the phone, his voice steady, almost too steady, telling me not to worry about anything and to take all the time I needed. He had said it more than once, actually, as if repeating it would make it more believable. I did not question it then. I wanted to believe that the boy I raised still understood what this place meant to me. While I was gone, I called only once. It was late in the evening, the kind of hour when the day has already decided to end but sleep has not yet arrived. Daniel answered on the second ring. He sounded distracted, like someone who had one foot in a conversation and another somewhere else entirely. When I asked how things were at the farm, he gave me simple answers. Everything is fine. Nothing to worry about. Just taking care of a few things. I remember asking what kind of things, but he brushed it off lightly, changing the subject before I could press further. At the time, I told myself he was just busy. After all, managing a farm is not a small task. There are fences to repair, animals to feed, equipment to maintain. There is always something that needs attention. But now, standing in that kitchen, I realized that what he had been taking care of had never been about the farm at all. It had been about preparing for something else. Something deliberate. Something quiet. As I looked around, I began to notice the details I had missed at first. The cabinet drawers were slightly open, as if someone had gone through them quickly and did not bother to close them all the way. The calendar on the wall had been taken down, leaving behind a faint square where the paint was still darker. Even the coffee maker had been moved, its usual spot on the counter left empty, replaced by a small stack of papers that did not belong there. I stepped closer and glanced at them without touching. Printed documents. Legal forms. I did not need to read every word to understand the nature of them. My name appeared more than once, typed neatly in places where I had never signed anything. That was when the pieces began to shift into place, slowly at first, then all at once. The phone calls that ended too quickly. The reassurance that came too easily. The quiet distance that had grown between us over the past year, subtle enough to ignore, until now. Behind me, I could feel Ashley's presence without turning around. She had not followed me into the kitchen immediately. She was giving me space, not out of respect, but out of strategy. Let her see. Let her notice. Let her understand just enough. I had seen that kind of patience before, though I had chosen not to recognize it at the time. It had shown itself in small ways over the years. The way she would speak for Daniel when I asked him direct questions. The way plans would change without including me, always with a reasonable explanation, always with a polite smile. I had told myself it was normal. That families evolve. That children grow into their own lives. But there is a difference between growing apart and being quietly pushed aside. And standing there, in a kitchen that no longer felt like mine, I understood that the distance had not happened by accident. It had been built, one decision at a time, until I was no longer part of the center, but something on the edges. I reached out and straightened one of the papers on the counter, not to read it, but to feel it beneath my fingers. Smooth. Official. Final. Daniel had stepped into the doorway now, his reflection faint in the glass of the cabinet across from me. He still had not said a word. Not an apology. Not an explanation. Just silence. The same silence he had given me over the phone, now heavier, more permanent. I did not turn to face him. Not yet. Because in that moment, I was no longer trying to understand what they were doing. I already knew. What mattered now was something else entirely. How long they had been planning it. And more importantly, how much they believed I would never see it coming. I finally turned to look at Daniel, not with anger, not with urgency, but with a quiet kind of attention that I had learned over the years says far more than raised voices ever could. He shifted slightly under my gaze, just enough to betray that he was not as steady as he wanted to appear. His hands were still in his pockets, but his shoulders had tightened, and his eyes moved past me instead of meeting mine directly. That alone told me everything I needed to know about where he stood. "How long?" I asked, my voice even, controlled, as if I were asking about something small and ordinary. The question hung in the air between us, simple on the surface, but heavy with everything it carried underneath. He hesitated. Not long, just a second or two, but it was enough. Ashley answered before he could. "It has been in progress for a while," she said from behind me, her tone calm, almost practiced, as if she had prepared for this moment and was simply following a script. I did not turn toward her. I kept my eyes on Daniel. "A while," I repeated quietly, letting the words settle. "That is not a measure of time, Daniel." He swallowed, his jaw tightening slightly. "A few months," he said finally, though even as he spoke, there was something uncertain in the way he said it, like he knew the truth stretched further back than that. A few months. I let that sit in my mind, turning it over slowly, placing it against the memories that had begun to surface in pieces. The missed calls. The shortened visits. The way he had stopped asking me about the farm and started telling me what he thought should be done instead. It had not happened all at once. It had been gradual, quiet, almost polite. And that was what made it so effective. "And you thought I would not notice," I said, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. This time, either of them answered. The silence that followed was different from before. It was not empty. It was full. Full of things they had not said, things they had chosen not to explain, things they were still deciding whether to admit. I stepped past Daniel and walked slowly into the living room. The space felt larger now, not because it had grown, but because it had been emptied. The couch was gone. The bookshelf that used to hold decades of collected memories was gone. Even the old clock that had hung above the fireplace, ticking steadily through every season of my life here, had been taken down. Only the faint outline remained on the wall, a pale rectangle where time itself seemed to have been removed. I walked to the window and looked out across the fields. The land was still there. Acres of it, stretching out in every direction, just as it always had. The barn stood where it always stood. The fences traced the same lines they had for years. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had shifted. Behind me, I could hear Ashley speaking quietly to one of the workers again, her voice steady, confident, directing the movement of things that did not belong to her. That was when I noticed something else. Not what was missing, but what had been left behind. On the small side table near the window, there was a single photograph. It had not been packed. It had not been taken. It sat there, almost forgotten. I picked it up slowly. It was an old one. Daniel, maybe 8 years old, standing in front of the barn with a crooked smile, dirt on his jeans, his hands wrapped proudly around a small wooden fence post he had insisted on helping me build. I remembered that day clearly. He had refused to go inside, even when the sun started to set, determined to finish what he had started. He had looked at me then with something simple and certain in his eyes. Trust. Pride. Belonging. I held the photograph for a moment longer before setting it back down exactly where I found it. Some things, it seemed, were no longer worth holding onto. I turned back toward the doorway, where Daniel still stood, watching me now, though he quickly looked away when our eyes met. Ashley had stepped aside, giving us a clear line of sight, as if she understood that whatever was happening here had moved beyond her instructions and into something more personal. "You have been busy," I said quietly. It was not praise. It was not criticism. It was simply an observation. Daniel nodded once, a small, almost mechanical movement. "We are trying to make things more manageable," he said, choosing his words carefully, as if they might protect him from what they meant. Manageable. I let that word settle the same way I had let the others settle. It was interesting how easily something so significant could be reduced to a word that sounded so reasonable. So harmless. I took a slow breath and looked around the room one more time, letting my eyes trace the empty spaces, the altered details, the quiet evidence of decisions made without me. And in that moment, something became clear in a way it had not been before. This was not just about what they were taking. It was about what they believed they had already taken from me long before I walked through that door. And as I stood there, surrounded by the absence of my own life, I realized that whatever they thought they had secured, whatever they believed they had already claimed, was built on one very simple assumption. That I would accept it without question. That I would stand here, see what they had done, and simply step aside. And that was the second mistake they had made. I did not argue with him because there was nothing left to argue about, and as I stood there in that hollowed-out room, I found myself thinking not about what had just happened, but about everything that had led to it, the quiet moments I had dismissed, the small shifts I had explained away, the times I had chosen patience over suspicion because that is what mothers do when they still believe their children are acting out of love and not calculation. I remembered the first time Ashley had suggested changes to the farm. It had been nearly 2 years ago, a casual conversation over dinner where she mentioned that the property could be more profitable if it were managed differently, more efficiently, her words measured, her tone polite, and I had smiled and nodded because I thought it was just an idea, nothing more than that. Something young people say when they are eager to improve things they do not yet understand. Daniel had agreed with her that night, though he had done it carefully, watching my reaction as if he were testing the ground beneath his feet, and I had told him the same thing I had always told him, that this farm was not built on quick decisions or numbers on paper, but on years of steady work and knowing when to leave things as they are. He had not argued, not then. He had simply gone quiet, the way he used to when he was a boy and did not get his way, only now there had been something else in that silence, something I did not recognize at the time. After that, the suggestions came more often, never directly, always wrapped in concern, in practicality, in words that sounded reasonable if you did not look too closely. They talked about upkeep, about taxes, about how much easier things would be if certain responsibilities were shared or transferred. Ashley was always the one who spoke first, Daniel following just behind her, echoing her thoughts as if they had already been discussed long before they reached me. I remember one afternoon in particular, standing out by the fence line while Daniel checked the posts. He had mentioned that it might make sense to put some of the property in his name, just for convenience, just in case anything ever happened to me. He had said it lightly, almost as a joke, but he had not been laughing. I had looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a brief moment I had seen something unfamiliar in his expression, not impatience, not frustration, but expectation, as if he believed the answer had already been decided. I told him no, gently but clearly, explaining that everything was already arranged, that there was no need to rush into anything like that, and he had nodded, too quickly, too easily, dropping the subject as if it had never mattered in the first place. That should have been the moment I paid closer attention. That should have been the moment I asked more questions. But I did not, because I trusted him, because I believed that whatever differences we had in perspective, the foundation between us was still the same as it had always been. Looking back now, I can see how each of those conversations was not a suggestion, but a step, not a concern, but a plan taking shape slowly enough that I would not notice until it was already in motion. The distance between us had not appeared overnight. It had been built carefully, layer by layer, until I was no longer part of the decisions being made about my own life. And Ashley, she had understood that from the beginning. She had never pushed too hard, never demanded anything outright. Instead, she had created space. Space for Daniel to step into, space for ideas to grow without resistance, space for me to be moved quietly to the side without ever being directly told that was what was happening. I turned slightly, my gaze moving back toward the kitchen where those papers still sat on the counter, neat and deliberate, as if they had been waiting for me to find them. It was not just about signatures or ownership. It was about timing. About knowing exactly when I would be gone, exactly how long I would be away, exactly how much they could do before I came back and saw what had been set in motion. That kind of planning does not happen in a few weeks. It does not happen by accident. It takes intention. It takes agreement. It takes a level of certainty that the person you are doing it to will not stand in your way. I let out a slow breath and rested my hand lightly on the back of one of the remaining chairs, feeling the worn wood beneath my fingers, familiar in a way that everything else no longer was. Daniel had moved further into the room now, though he still kept his distance, as if unsure how close he was allowed to come. Ashley watched from the side, her posture composed, her expression unchanged, as if this were simply a stage in a process she had already completed in her mind. And in that moment, as the past and present settled into place around me, I understood something with complete clarity. This was never about making things easier. It was never about helping. It was about taking control slowly enough that by the time I noticed, they would already believe it belonged to them. And as I stood there, surrounded by the quiet evidence of everything they had been building behind my back, I realized that the real question was not why they had done it. The real question was how far they were willing to go now that they believed they had already succeeded. The room had grown quieter, not because the work had stopped, but because something in the air had shifted, something that made even the sound of footsteps feel out of place, as if the house itself was listening. I moved back toward the kitchen slowly, not with urgency, but with intention, letting each step carry the weight of everything I had just realized. The papers were still there, exactly where I had left them, untouched, waiting. I reached for the top one this time, lifting it carefully, not rushing, not letting my hands betray anything I was thinking. The paper was thicker than standard print, the kind used for official filings, the kind meant to look important even before you read a single word. My eyes moved across the lines, taking in names, dates, references to parcels of land I knew better than anyone. Sections of the farm. Specific portions. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to matter. Enough to change things. I noticed the signatures first. Daniel's was there, unmistakable, though slightly different from how he used to sign when he was younger, more practiced now, more deliberate. And then there was mine. Or something that was meant to look like mine. I stared at it for a moment longer than I should have, not because I was confused, but because I was confirming what I already knew. I had not signed this. Not here. Not like this. I set the paper back down. Gently, aligning it with the others as if I were simply tidying up. Behind me, I could feel both of them watching now, waiting for a reaction, waiting for me to ask the question they were prepared to answer. But I did not give them that. Not yet. Instead, I glanced around the kitchen again, this time more carefully, letting my attention settle on the smaller things. The drawer near the sink was slightly open. That drawer had always held a set of spare keys, old receipts, a few personal notes I had never thrown away. I stepped over and pulled it open fully. The keys were gone. Every single one. The receipts had been shifted, stacked in a way that was too neat to be accidental. Someone had gone through them, looked at dates, amounts, details. Not for curiosity. For information. I closed the drawer slowly and turned back toward the counter. "You have been thorough," I said, my voice steady, almost conversational. Ashley stepped forward slightly this time, her presence more direct, as if she sensed that this was the moment where things would either become easier or more complicated. "We are just organizing things properly," she replied, her tone calm, controlled, each word chosen carefully. "It is better this way. For everyone. Better." I let that word settle the same way the others had. It was interesting how often that word appeared when people were making decisions that did not belong to them. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if I were considering what she had said. Daniel shifted again, finally stepping closer, though he still did not meet my eyes fully. "We were going to talk to you," he added, his voice quieter than before, almost defensive. "We just needed to get things in order first." In order. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a brief moment I saw the boy he used to be beneath the man standing in front of me. But it was faint now, overshadowed by something else, something shaped by decisions he could no longer step away from. "You already did," I said simply. He frowned slightly, confusion crossing his face. "What do you mean?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached for another paper, scanning it briefly before setting it back down. The pattern was clear now. Pieces being moved. Names being shifted. Control being transferred in small, careful increments. Not a single move bold enough to draw attention on its own, but together forming something much larger. "You told me everything I needed to know," I continued, my voice calm, almost reflective. "Not with words." That seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation would have. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then stopped, as if he realized there was nothing he could say that would change what had already been done. Ashley remained composed, her expression steady, though I noticed the slight tightening at the corner of her eyes, the only sign that she understood this was not unfolding the way she had expected. I stepped back from the counter, giving myself space, giving them the impression that I was stepping away from the situation itself. That was important. Let them think that. Let them believe that what they had done had already settled into place. Because standing there, in the quiet of that kitchen, surrounded by evidence of their careful planning, I realized something else just as clearly as everything that had come before. They had prepared for my return. They had prepared for questions. They had prepared for resistance. But they had not prepared for silence. And that, I understood now, was where everything would begin to change. I did not stay in that kitchen much longer because there was nothing left there that belonged to me in the way it used to, and more importantly, there was nothing left for me to reveal about what I was thinking. I picked up my purse again, the same one I had set down only minutes earlier, and moved toward the hallway without asking for permission, without looking back to see if they would try to stop me. They did not. That told me more than anything else could have. If they truly believed they needed my approval, they would have said something. If they believed I still held authority here, they would have hesitated. But they let me walk past them as if I were already a guest in my own home, someone passing through rather than someone who had built every inch of it with her own hands. I moved down the hallway slowly, my fingers brushing lightly against the wall as I went, feeling the familiar texture beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in something that had not yet been taken. The first door on the left was my bedroom. Or at least, it had been. I pushed it open gently and stepped inside. The bed was still there, but stripped. No blankets. No pillows. The dresser drawers were open, half empty, the contents shifted into boxes that had already been sealed and labeled in neat handwriting that was not mine. My clothes were folded differently than I would have done it, stacked in a way that felt efficient but impersonal, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. I walked to the closet and opened it. Half of it was empty. The other half held only a few items, pieces that had either been overlooked or deemed unimportant. I reached out and touched one of the hangers, letting it sway slightly under my hand, the small motion echoing in the quiet room. There was a time when this space had been full, not just of things, but of life. Mornings that started before sunrise. Evenings that ended with tired hands and a sense of completion. Now it felt like a place that had already been closed, even though I was still standing inside it. I turned and moved toward the nightstand. The drawer was open there too, but unlike the others, it had not been emptied completely. Inside, there were a few small items left behind. A pair of reading glasses. A folded piece of paper. And something else, tucked beneath them, barely visible unless you knew where to look. I reached in slowly and lifted the paper first, unfolding it just enough to recognize it as an old receipt, something that did not matter. I set it aside and picked up the glasses, holding them for a moment before placing them back exactly where they had been. Then I reached for the item underneath. It was small. Thin. A key. Not one of the usual ones. Not the spare set from the kitchen drawer. This one was older, its edges worn, its surface slightly dulled with age. I turned it over in my fingers, feeling the familiar weight of it, and for the first time since I had walked through the front door, something inside me settled into place. They had been thorough, yes. Careful. Methodical. But not perfect. There are things you cannot take if you do not know they exist. I closed the drawer gently, leaving everything exactly as I had found it, and slipped the key into my pocket without hesitation. Behind me, I could hear movement in the hallway, footsteps approaching, then stopping just short of the doorway. I did not turn around immediately. I let the silence stretch again, letting them wonder what I had found, what I had noticed, what I was thinking. That uncertainty was important. Finally, I turned and met Daniel's gaze. He looked different now, not because anything about him had changed physically, but because I was seeing him clearly for the first time in a long while. There was tension in his expression, something unsettled, something waiting. Ashley stood just behind him, her posture still composed, though her eyes had sharpened slightly, watching me more closely than before. "We have arranged a place for you," she said, breaking the silence, her tone smooth, almost reassuring. "It is smaller, easier to manage. You will be more comfortable there." I listened to her words without interrupting, without reacting, letting them fall into the space between us where so many other things had already been placed. A place for me. Smaller. Easier. Words chosen not to offend, but to direct. To move. To close one door and open another that had already been decided for me. I nodded once, as if I were considering the idea. "That is very thoughtful," I said quietly. And for the first time since I had returned, Ashley's expression shifted, just slightly, as if she had expected resistance, not agreement. Daniel looked at me, searching my face for something he could recognize, something familiar, something that would tell him he still understood who I was. But he did not find it. Because standing there, in a room that no longer held my life the way it once had, I had already begun to step into something else entirely. Something they had not planned for. Something they had not prepared to face. And as I walked past them again, moving back toward the front of the house with steady, unhurried steps, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They believed this was the end of something. But for me, it was only the beginning of what came next. The front door was still open when I stepped out onto the porch again, the late afternoon light now softer, stretching across the land in a way that made everything look calm, almost unchanged, if you did not look too closely. I paused there for a moment, not because I was unsure of what to do next, but because I wanted to take one last look at everything as they saw it now, not as it had been, but as they believed it had become. The moving truck was still there, half full, the workers continuing their quiet routine, lifting, carrying, placing, following instructions that had nothing to do with me. Ashley stood near the steps again, her attention divided between the work and me, watching carefully, measuring every movement, every expression, as if trying to determine whether she had missed something. Daniel remained a few steps behind her, his posture uncertain, his eyes drifting between the ground and my face, never quite settling in one place long enough to hold. I walked down the steps slowly, my hand brushing against the wooden railing, feeling the familiar grooves worn into it over decades of use. There was a time when Daniel used to sit right there, on the second step, waiting for me to come out in the mornings, asking questions about things he barely understood but wanted to learn anyway. I did not stop to linger on that memory. Not anymore. Instead, I continued down the path toward the gravel driveway, my pace steady, my movements unhurried. "Where are you going?" Daniel asked finally, his voice carrying just enough uncertainty to reveal that he was no longer sure of what came next. I turned slightly, just enough to look at him without fully facing him. "I have a few things to take care of," I said, my tone calm, almost routine, as if I were speaking about errands, something ordinary, something expected. Ashley stepped forward then, her expression composed but more alert than before. "If you need help with anything, we can arrange it," she offered, her voice smooth, controlled. Each word placed carefully. "Arrange it." I nodded once, acknowledging her words without accepting them. "I am sure you can," I replied quietly. And for a brief moment, something flickered again in her eyes, something sharper this time, as if she sensed that the conversation was no longer moving in the direction she had anticipated. I continued walking toward my car, the gravel shifting under my boots, the sound grounding, familiar, steady. When I reached the driver's side door, I paused again, my hand resting lightly on the handle. I did not open it right away. Instead, I turned back one last time, letting my eyes move across the house, the porch, the truck, the people who now stood there as if they belonged in a place they had only just begun to occupy. They looked settled, confident, certain. That certainty was important. It meant they believed the work was already done. It meant they believed there was nothing left for me to do but accept what had been decided. I opened the car door and slid into the seat, placing my purse beside me, my movements measured, controlled, leaving no room for interpretation. As I started the engine, the low hum filled the quiet space around me, and for a moment I simply sat there, my hands resting lightly on the wheel, my eyes forward. I did not look back again. Not as I pulled out of the driveway. Not as the house disappeared behind me in the rearview mirror. Not as the road stretched out ahead, long and familiar, leading away from everything they believed they had taken. The drive into town took just over 20 minutes, the same as it always had, the same road I had driven countless times before, though it felt different now, not because the road had changed, but because I had. I passed the old feed store, the small diner on the corner, the gas station where Daniel used to insist on buying candy when he was a child. Everything was exactly where it had always been. Steady. Predictable. Unlike what I had just left behind. I turned onto Main Street and parked in front of a small brick building I had not visited in quite some time. The sign above the door was simple, understated, the kind that does not draw attention unless you already know what you are looking for. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the entrance, my steps steady, my expression calm. Inside, the air was cooler, quieter, the kind of quiet that comes from people who deal in matters that are not meant to be rushed. A man behind the desk looked up as I entered, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to recognition in a matter of seconds. "Mrs. Collins," he said, standing slightly, his tone respectful, familiar. "It has been a while." I nodded once, meeting his gaze with the same calm I had carried with me since I left the house. "Yes," I replied. "It has." I paused for just a moment, letting the weight of everything I had seen, everything I had understood, settle into something clear and focused. "I believe it is time we review a few things," I added quietly. And as I stood there, in a place where decisions were written down, recorded, made official, I knew with complete certainty that whatever they thought they had secured back at the farm was only part of the story. The part they could see. The part they believed mattered most. But there are always other parts. Parts that remain unseen until the moment they are needed. And I had just decided it was time to bring those parts into the light. I followed him into his office without hesitation, the door closing softly behind me, sealing off the outside world and everything that had just happened at the farm as if it belonged to another version of my life. The room had not changed much since the last time I had been there. The same wooden desk. The same shelves lined with neatly organized folders. The same quiet sense of order that comes from years of handling matters people only bring forward when something important is at stake. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing for a moment, taking in the space, letting my thoughts settle into something clear and deliberate before I spoke again. "I would like to review all documents related to my property," I said, my voice calm, steady, leaving no room for misinterpretation. He nodded immediately, his expression shifting from polite familiarity to professional focus. "Of course," he replied, already moving toward one of the cabinets behind his desk. "Has something happened?" I did not answer that question directly. Instead, I stepped closer to the desk and placed my purse down, my fingers resting lightly on the surface as I watched him pull a file from the cabinet. It was thicker than I remembered, its edges slightly worn from handling, a sign that it had not simply been sitting untouched over the years. That detail did not escape me. He returned to the desk and opened the file carefully, flipping through several sections before turning it toward me. "These are the original deeds, along with any amendments that have been filed," he explained, his tone measured, precise. I leaned forward slightly, my eyes scanning the pages, taking in names, dates, legal descriptions that mapped out every acre of land I had spent my life maintaining. Everything was there. Everything as it should have been. At least on the surface. "And any recent filings?" I asked, lifting my gaze just enough to meet his. He paused for a moment, just long enough to confirm that he understood the weight behind the question. Then he reached for another folder, thinner, newer, and placed it beside the first. "There have been a few submissions in the past several months," he said carefully. "Nothing that has been fully executed, but drafts, proposals, preliminary transfers." I opened the second folder slowly, my hand steady, my expression unchanged. The documents inside were familiar in structure, but different in intent. Portions of land marked for reassignment. Language that suggested shared ownership. Clauses that, if completed, would shift control in ways that could not easily be reversed. And there it was again. My name. My signature. Or at least, something meant to represent it. I let out a slow breath, not in shock, but in confirmation. "These were not signed by me," I said quietly, my voice carrying no anger, only certainty. He nodded once, his expression tightening slightly. "I had my concerns," he admitted. "That is why none of these were finalized. There were inconsistencies. Timing that did not quite align." I closed the folder gently and rested my hand on top of it, feeling the weight of it beneath my palm. They had come further than I initially thought, but not far enough. "Not yet. Has anyone else attempted to access or alter the primary documents?" I asked. He shook his head. "No one without proper authorization," he replied. "And that has not changed." Proper authorization. I let that phrase settle in my mind, fitting it into the larger picture that had been forming since the moment I saw that truck in my driveway. They had been moving quickly, but they had not completed the process. They had prepared the ground, but they had not secured it. Not completely. I reached into my pocket then and felt the small key resting there, its presence quiet but significant. There were still parts of this story they did not know existed. Parts they had not accounted for. I looked back at him, my expression composed, my voice steady. "I will need copies of everything," I said. "Every document, every draft, every filing that has been submitted in relation to my property." He nodded again without hesitation. "I will have them prepared for you," he replied. There was a brief pause then, the kind that often comes when something important has been said but not yet fully acknowledged. "Would you like me to take any additional action?" he asked carefully. I considered that question for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood that the answer would set the direction for everything that followed. I shook my head slightly. "Not yet," I said. "For now, I just need to understand exactly what has been put in motion." He accepted that without further question, gathering the documents and setting them aside with quiet efficiency. As I stood there, in that office where everything was recorded, documented, made official, I felt the last pieces of uncertainty settle into place. What had happened at the farm was not the end of anything. It was a step. A move. One they believed had already secured their position. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed that I would not look beyond what was visible. That I would not question what had been presented. That I would not take the time to understand the full extent of what they had tried to do. And as I picked up my purse and prepared to leave, I knew with complete clarity that whatever they thought they had already taken was only part of the story. The rest was still in my hands. I stepped out of the office with the folder in my hand, the weight of it steady, grounding, not heavy in the way something burdens you, but in the way something reminds you that you are still in control of what comes next. The air outside felt different, cooler against my skin, as if the world itself had shifted slightly while I was inside, or perhaps it was just me. I walked back to my car without rushing, each step deliberate, my thoughts no longer scattered but aligned, clear in a way they had not been when I first saw that truck in my driveway. I placed the folder carefully on the passenger seat and sat down behind the wheel, closing the door with a quiet finality that seemed louder in the stillness around me. For a moment, I did not start the engine. I simply sat there, my hands resting lightly on the wheel, my eyes focused on the street ahead, but my mind moving through everything I had just confirmed. They had tried to move quickly. They had tried to stay just ahead of me, just far enough that by the time I noticed, it would already be too late to question anything. But they had misjudged one thing. They had assumed that time worked only in their favor. I reached into my pocket and felt the small key again, its edges pressing lightly against my fingers, a quiet reminder of something they had not found, something they had not even known to look for. There are always layers to a life built over decades, things placed carefully, intentionally, not for immediate use, but for moments when they become necessary. I started the engine then, the familiar sound filling the car, and pulled back onto the road without hesitation. The drive back felt shorter this time, not because the distance had changed, but because I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I already knew. Now, I was simply moving toward what needed to be done. When the farm came back into view, the sun had dipped lower, casting longer shadows across the land, stretching everything out in a way that made it seem almost still, almost paused. The truck was still there, though more of it was now filled. The work had continued in my absence, just as they had planned. I pulled into the driveway and parked in the same spot as before, turning off the engine and stepping out without hesitation. This time, I did not pause on the porch. I did not take in the scene as something unfamiliar. I walked straight inside, my steps steady, my presence no longer uncertain. Daniel and Ashley were in the living room, standing closer together now, speaking in low voices that stopped the moment I entered. They both turned toward me, their expressions shifting almost in unison, not quite relief, not quite concern, but something in between, something that suggested they were still trying to understand where I stood. I set the folder down on the same table where the photograph had been earlier, placing it carefully, deliberately, making sure they saw it. Either of them spoke. That was fine. I did not need them to. "You have been working very hard," I said, my voice calm, even, carrying none of the weight they might have expected. Ashley straightened slightly, her posture firm, her expression controlled, though her eyes moved briefly to the folder before returning to my face. Daniel shifted his weight, his hands no longer in his pockets now, as if he understood that something had changed, even if he did not yet know what. I let the silence stretch for a moment, just long enough for them to feel it, to recognize that this was no longer the same silence they had been managing before. Then I reached into my pocket and placed the small key on the table beside the folder. The sound it made as it touched the surface was soft, but precise, drawing their attention immediately. Ashley's eyes narrowed slightly, just enough to reveal that she did not recognize it. Daniel looked at it, then at me, confusion crossing his face. "There are things you do not know about this place," I said quietly, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. I watched as the understanding began to shift between them, subtle at first, then more visible, as the certainty they had carried started to loosen, just slightly. "You have been preparing for this for a while," I continued, my voice steady, controlled. "But so have I." That was not entirely true in the way they would interpret it, but it did not need to be. What mattered was what they believed in that moment. Ashley's composure held, but I could see the calculation returning to her eyes, faster now, sharper, trying to adjust, to reassess, to find footing again. Daniel looked between us, caught in that space where certainty begins to unravel, and something else takes its place. I rested my hand lightly on the table, feeling the surface beneath my fingers, familiar, steady, mine. "You thought you were taking everything," I said, my gaze moving from one to the other, holding just long enough to let the words settle. I paused then, not because I had nothing left to say, but because I understood the value of what is left unsaid. And in that moment, as the room grew quiet around us once again, I knew with complete certainty that whatever they had set in motion was no longer theirs to control. Because the one thing they had never truly accounted for was the person who had built it all in the first place. And now, I was no longer simply watching.